If you'd have told me that one of the films I'd spend the better half of 2022 obsessing over was a biopic on Elvis, I don't know if I'd believe you. Like many, I knew who Elvis was, I was familiar with his music, hell, even enjoyed a fair few of the songs as a kid thanks to my obsessive rewatches of Lilo and Stitch. And I even had a great aunt who worshipped Elvis. She loved the man, and from everything I was told was a lot like the girls losing their goddamn minds in this film. Elvis was this entity that certainly existed in my life as a kid, but I don't know if I was ever really a fan, an enthusiast, or what have you. Elvis was just that larger-than-life American icon who's about as ingrained in the fabric of the United States as George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. He was just one of those things you don't really think about. You don't, at least I never did, consider the fact that he was a normal guy, like you and me, because there's a million and one impersonators out there. His face is plastered on every inch of Las Vegas and beyond. His music has been remixed and used as needle drops in every early 2000s Vince Vaughn comedy and then some. He was almost like this mascot of American flash and excess. My knowledge and experience with Elvis Presley had always been with Elvis, the mythic American hero, and what I soon realized was Elvis, the lie. I never really stopped to consider the spiritual, soulful, tormented artist behind the blinding lights, exotic costumes, and flashy jewelry. I never realized the pain and passion behind every performance. A man at war with who he is and who he wants to be. A legend who was never really allowed to soar because he was swallowed whole by the corporate American machine. He was a rebel, an agitator, a unifier, an uplifter, a man with a fire inside of him to fight for a more equal tomorrow, and yet he was never truly allowed to be those things. He was just the latest pop sensation, the latest piece of mindless entertainment to consume. He was a fantasy, a facade of the picture-perfect American dream. And that's, unfortunately, how he's ultimately been remembered in the years since his death. Yet, every time Elvis took the stage, and you could see it in the archival footage, in the documentaries, in every performance, the man was allowed to break through and make us feel something with his words, the emotion in his voice, his movements. The soul was allowed to take over. I didn't realize it until I saw Baz Luhrmann's magnificent film, but Elvis is the quintessential American tragedy. He's our country's undying need to sell and consume, but he's also the soulful truth of an artist with a drive to make a difference, make art that means something. I don't know if it was Baz's penchant for American epics. I mean, he's basically one of the kings of them at this point between this, Great Gatsby, Romeo and Juliet. I mean, the guy knows how to tell a story about America. It's kind of impressive. Or the commercial versus creative battle over the soul of an artist and the art they create that rings as true today as it did in the 1950s. But I was enamored with the experience of it all, ever since that first viewing. Yes, understanding the story of Elvis Presley, but even more than that, using that story to call into question the very machinations of the American profit machine. This entry in the well-trodden music biopic genre, despite being the oft-derided womb to tomb story and having been released amid a resurgence of the bland standard just turn their Wikipedia article into a screenplay variety of biopic these past few years, manages to transcend those pitfalls for two main reasons. It's got what might be the performance of the year at its center, and it's being blasted onto our screens by a true auteur who is going for broke, man, and understands the greater narrative at play here. I'm talking about Baz Luhrmann's vital Elvis and Austin Butler's performance of a lifetime as the pop culture icon to end all pop culture icons, at least in America. It's a fearless display of filmmaking that runs so astray of what we expect from musical biopics that you could call the film downright unbecoming. But it's more than its cinematic excess, more even than Austin Butler's sensational turn as the king of rock. It lets us see through Elvis's eyes, and even through Colonel Tom Parker's eyes in a way, how the pursuit of that dream can create a star, but how our society can also claw that star apart for the most superficial version of what they represent. It shows, if anything, that we need to wake up from the American dream, because while Elvis Presley signifies its greatest realization, he simultaneously exemplifies its true nightmarish state. And that might sound like a dour, harrowing cinematic experience, but Baz Luhrmann pulled a magic trick with Elvis. He scorns the way pop culture treats talented individuals in the relentless greed of an opportunist like Tom Parker, yet he also manages to make Elvis something that ultimately looks fondly at the icon and reminds us why we ever fell in love with him in the first place. So turn up the lights and...
Well, it's one for the money, two for the show. Get ready now, go, cat, go. We're lost in a cloud. Viva Las Vegas.
You've got no music in your soul, sister.
Elvis was the strangest type of sensation in the 1950s. He awoke a previously unseen, totally rabid side of fans who weren't just obsessed with him, weren't just in love with him, they wanted to consume every last piece of him. He awoke something inside of them, a taste of forbidden fruit. Elvis Presley encapsulated and in many ways inaugurated the notion that America has an insatiable desire to consume the culture, soul, and spirit of artists, to absolutely obsess over them. Kind of like another film that came out during the summer that a lot of people didn't seem to really get. I'm talking about Nope. Yeah, it's about, yes, Jordan Peele's best film, Nope. I'm talking about that. He burst onto the scene at just the right time when the television was just beginning to become a staple of the American home. And he was just radical enough, just grotesque enough, a term which honestly feels hysterical to use regarding dance moves, but absolutely applies to any mid-1950s metric, to stir the pot, but also hold off the boiling over long enough to secure his deified status among the public. If there's one savvy thing Colonel Tom Parker ever did for Elvis, it's engineering the escalation of the controversy so that it exploded, but only when the time and place was right for it to explode. It was cruel, it was manipulative, and robbed Elvis of not only years of his career, but his ability to be with his mother in her final days. But it was also a meticulously calculated maneuver that paid off the way Parker intended. Baz Luhrmann's Elvis captures the machination at that point in Elvis's life fairly candidly, and it's a moment that serves as a microcosm for his approach to the film as a whole. Baz certainly wasn't interested in the traditional biopic with Elvis. I said earlier that it tells a womb-to-tomb story, and that is true. It covers Elvis's life from his early childhood up to just before his death in the 70s, but only in the most rudimentary sense. Basic structure aside, Baz could not have shied further away from that overused, boring mold. He wanted to treat this biopic the same way Shakespeare did his writings on Caesar or Richard III. Take a historical figure and use them to explore a larger idea, and to hell with whether or not you can create some anachronisms along the way. Using Colonel Tom as the point of view character reinforces this. Elvis is not Elvis Presley's story. It's the story of how someone in his inner circle saw him, and by extension, how a world crazed by the idea of Elvis saw him. It's a commentary on how we idolize pop culture figures and how it's the surface level visage of them that matters to us. Did people back then actually care about Elvis Presley, the human being? About Marilyn Monroe, John Lennon? Do people in the respective fan bases today actually care about Justin Bieber or Billie Eilish, or do they ultimately just find pleasure in the spectacle that surrounds them? I'm not trying to claim it's one way or the other. In fact, if anything, it's probably a fairly even split of both from person to person. I don't think Baz is trying to indict Elvis's fan base or any other group of pop culture icon fanatics either. I think he's just fascinated by the dichotomy of who a celebrity is to us versus who they really are. That, in turn, is what makes Elvis such a deeply fascinating film. Baz has often cited Amadeus and its approach to Mozart as an inspiration, particularly in how that film isn't really about Mozart at all, and its through line in that respect to Elvis just makes sense. Hell, Salieri is the protagonist of Amadeus, yet still the film isn't really about him either. It's a film about jealousy, about what it's like to be skilled at an art, to long for only for a once-in-a-generation talent to step right over you. It's the same thing that makes Inside Llewyn Davis all come together at the end. We spend 2 hours with a gifted songwriter and musician in 60s New York, only for Bob Dylan to walk on stage right after him and introduce Blowin' in the Wind to the world, and then someone beats the shit out of him in an alley. I see a lot of all of that in Elvis's depiction of Tom Parker. He He discovered Elvis. He made him a star. He was responsible for the absolute phenomenon that was Elvis. And yet, for 20 years, he goes pretty much unseen and unrecognized until the time's come for him to be regarded as the asshole who exploited, then ruined, and then destroyed Elvis. There's a resentment at Parker's core, first rooted in the lack of appreciation he perceives being directed his way during Elvis's life, and then in the scorn he faces after Elvis has died. And yet, there's still more to Tom Parker than that. And in turn, there is much more to the movie than that. Through Parker's life and Elvis's, Baz explores the larger idea of America in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. He takes a scalpel to the relationship between the commercial smash and the artist, the sell, as he describes, which is an incredibly American idea, versus the soul, which is also fundamentally American. Yet, the latter is also something America seems to constantly rail against. The various powers that be have consistently worked to uplift the sell and dismiss the soul. The Colonel is one of those, a carny who saw Elvis as the ultimate carnival act. It shocks, repels, and attracts, and desired to monetize it, which is his personification of the quintessential American idea to turn anything and everything into profit, no matter the cost. He's someone who enjoyed getting rich off of the art of Elvis, but he's also someone who reveled in the thrill of it all, in having his primal control over the hearts and desires of the American people. Colonel Tom Parker is an extraordinarily American character and could only exist in America at this scale. Achieved what he did by creating a completely fictitious character with a deep, dark secret, his country of origin, who clipped Elvis's wings because of his true outsider status being exposed. Baz's own experience of growing up thousands of miles away from America physically, while simultaneously feeling like Hollywood was all around him through his love of cinema, adds a lot of sense to his decision to make Tom Parker the narrator of his own version of a story about Elvis, rather than just telling Elvis's story. As Baz himself put it, having grown up in a completely isolated place on the edge of the world, I'm the ultimate outsider who also happens to know as much about Maxwell Smart and the Brady Bunch as any American. So I think I'm always outside looking in, but I'm also inside looking out. I think that's true of the Colonel. I think you look at it and you see the best of America and the worst of America. Baz might not have said it quite verbatim, but Tom Parker embodies both the sweet promise and bitter truth of the American dream, having conned Elvis with it. Baz goes on to say, having the Colonel advocate for himself in this sort of morphine dream, whether we agree with that device or not, it's his telling. It's only ever going to be someone's telling. Alongside that particular telling comes Baz's equally particular, nigh overload serving of cinematic style. He can't tell a story any other way than in the most cinematic way he can imagine. That's why when you watch Elvis, during that first hour, Baz is unafraid to jump almost chaotically from Elvis's childhood to the time when Parker discovered him to 20 years after the legend's death. I sort of jump cut and run around, I join all sorts of dots, and hopefully in the end there's a larger point and you get it. There's a bit of irony along the way, but there's a lot of truth. That's how I tell stories, and I think the closer you get to telling a story the way you actually are, the more honest it's going to be. Baz is putting all the pieces in place and outlining the key points of how this story is going to go before he dials it back and lets you go along for the rest of the tale in an entirely linear fashion. And it works as well if you consider that this is all being shown to us from the POV of Tom Parker in the wake of his stroke, initially picking at various snippets of his version of events in a panic before he relaxes somewhat once he's hospitalized and is able to recount his side of things in a more coherent fashion. What's interesting about that is how Parker works literally to the last to try and manipulate us. Parker, of course, is a manipulative carny who will pack up and leave whenever he has to save his own skin. He has no loyalty, no soul. It's almost like he dies because he has no other direction left in which to escape. The world has irreversibly found out how full of shit he is. He accumulated so much debt, drowned in the commercialism of the American dream, literally became another person to get away from it all, and latched onto Elvis as his golden goose. And yet, For all his machinations, it all came crumbling down on top of him anyway. But he too is a microcosm of the American dream and its falsehoods. Parker was just as deceived by the America that is telecast to the world as any one of Elvis's fans have ever been. Perhaps the most pathetic, even tragic element to his character is he lives and dies believing that he mattered the most in the story, that this was his story at all. Baz outright rejects that notion. Elvis didn't need the Colonel to make the impact he does. Elvis was the show. He knew what people needed and wanted to hear. The Colonel is ashamed of who he is and where he comes from, so much so that he creates a new identity to start fresh, to be whoever he wants to be, and wouldn't ever lift those up around him with the power his machinations gain him. Elvis, on the other hand, does uplift. He uses his platform to either pay it back, for example, to his family, or pay it forward, for example, to the communities of black musicians he grew up being inspired by, particularly in times where they were fighting hardest for their civil rights. The Colonel sees Elvis as the big spectacle show creature of his carnival. He'll use him to shake the people down out of all their money, but have them leaving smiling and happy. He claims Elvis does this with his dancing. However, what the Colonel doesn't understand is that Elvis's wiggle isn't the act. It's just Elvis. The Colonel is the one putting on a dazzling faux spectacle. Elvis, in turn, gets what he wants initially, but a wedge starts to be driven between the art and soul on one side and spectacle and consumerism on the other.
Now, do you want to go into politics, or shall we stay in show business?
The Colonel asks as 1968 comes around, representative of how many felt at the time, at least old school traditionalists, that art is simply to entertain and we need to keep soul, messaging, humanity, politics out of it. And boy, doesn't that sound familiar. Whew, things don't change. It's just about profit and audience reaction. Soul has no place in art. He even twists the words of civil rights activists like Martin Luther King Jr., like so many do in order to make a point and act like they aren't racist or bigoted, to get inside the head of Elvis.
Oh, and as I recall, Dr. King said rock and roll music contributed to juvenile delinquency.
But that's where Elvis counters and wrecks Tom Parker's bullshit argument in one sentence.
When things are too dangerous to say, sing.
There is so much in that line of dialogue. That was the power of Elvis and his performance. That is the power of art. When people don't want to hear what they need to, appeal to their emotions and make them feel something, move them into action. You can already start to see the frustration of Elvis, not being allowed to be who he is, to move the way he does, to sing and perform the way that makes him feel like himself, the way that makes him feel alive, because the spectacle comes first. Not the artist, not the creativity. People cry out for the old Elvis while the system around Elvis refuses to listen. As his mother put it,
The way you sing and move, it's God-given, so there can't be nothing wrong with it.
the truth comes from Elvis and those who are passionate about him. The obfuscation and lies come from the carnival managers and exploiters like the Colonel. One particular sequence from the film that resonates with that idea is early in Elvis's career, when he goes to Beale Street, where black music reigns supreme, to feel free and alive, to connect to his roots, to what gave him spirit and soul. Elvis is in the unique position where, since he's, as B.B. King says, a famous white boy, he can spread the gospel of black music while shedding light on the artists who made it in a way that can actually do some good, open eyes, unite people. It's about what he can do being someone who's lived in black communities, who has been accepted there since he was a young kid. It becomes a vital part of his life. People like Elvis because he spoke truth. He exuded passion. He was honest and unabashed. His mere existence is proof that people can live harmoniously. He chose his audience and his fans over what the government or even Tom Parker wanted. He chose the people. All of the fears the Colonel is using to hang over his head, exposing his father's past, reducing him to Elvis the draft dodger. These are all things that would have made a statement coming from Elvis had Parker instead not fought them. It would have humanized Elvis, made him more relatable and appealing, would have cemented himself as an artist with a soul, with a core set of beliefs and something to fight for. But ultimately, because of the Colonel using him as a carnival act, he's trying to sever his creative ties until he's just an object, a spectacle, and nothing more. Something he can use to run the snow job on not only Elvis, but America. Being from the carnival, if there's one thing Parker is not, it's honest. Honesty is the death of the circus. Once the illusion is broken and all is revealed, that's it. It's all over, which is the exact opposite of Elvis and the art he was creating. The performance, the message through song, not words. The Colonel's deepest, darkest secret is the thing that holds Elvis back. The Colonel not being who he claims to be. He's prioritizing himself and upholding this facade over all else, hence why he's willing to kowtow to the establishment. There are these moments of vulnerability throughout Elvis's life where the Colonel takes advantage of him, pretending to be a friend or a father figure in order to steer Elvis in the direction he wants him to go, because Elvis's father is weak. He's a microcosm for so many who knew what was happening with Elvis and how the Colonel was burning his flame until there was nothing left, yet did nothing, stood by because it was to their benefit. And as I'm saying all of this, I'm just thinking about how this can apply to so many other artists, specifically artists of color, who've had their work, their experiences, their genius exploited by the white machine for profit. I mean, it's really easy to look at the film industry and see how that's been a thing since like the dawn of motion pictures. And honestly, for as much as people might think that Elvis and Nope are not really on the same wavelength, they have a lot more in common with what they're trying to say than you might expect, and they make for really compelling companion pieces. I'd also throw Babylon in there as well. But anyways, one of the things that this film excels at is its choice and placement of songs. There obviously isn't any kind of shortage of hit Elvis tunes to use in the soundtrack, but that almost makes it more difficult to choose which ones to narrow the catalog down to for your story. Baz, however, was definitely the man for the job in this respect, and his choices reflect his long-proven ear for a perfect soundtrack. Seriously, no one makes a soundtrack like Baz Luhrmann. Remember that Great Gatsby soundtrack? Holy fuck, oh God, it's so good. I particularly love the way Cotton Candy Land and all of the Carney music almost builds a front of consumerism against Elvis's artistry, a war fought over his soul and future. It clashes with Suspicious Minds, which really symbolizes the battle between art and commerce that Baz is trying to chronicle. Having the newsreels play out and condemn Parker while Suspicious Minds plays is a great way to highlight the soul of Elvis speaking out against Parker, and yet again, the dichotomy of Elvis the showman and the Colonel the snowman. It's a unique trick that gives the audience an avenue to root for Elvis, even though they probably shouldn't be celebrating. It's a small victory in a larger war that we know Elvis will lose against Parker and the hollow treasures he stands for. There's also the amazing Vegas toxic Hollywood montage of Elvis getting everything he ever wanted, and then images of the real 1960s emerge behind him as he becomes increasingly more dissatisfied. It's really genius visual storytelling that pairs perfectly with the music. Elvis's life becomes a Hollywood movie, and in turn, he's further mythologized, further commercialized, instead of being allowed to follow his emotional, creative pursuits. Elvis was more than just a pop star turned actor. He had real talent, but the Colonel and the media wouldn't dare feed the general public something risky like that, something with a soul. Elvis was a product, and when he entered into Hollywood, he became even more of one. It got to a point where the Colonel was treating the man like merchandise as much as he was the physical merch he was selling. This is the beginning of the pinnacle of the sell. He commercializes his domestic life, fairy tale wedding, his wife, his Memphis Mafia. Everyone and everything in Elvis's life had a label, was a fantasy that the Colonel was shoving down people's throats. And then along came the Beatles. The true American dream of Elvis never made it out. Maybe it trickled out every now and then, but what was put out there was ultimately the phony, manufactured one. The lie told to us on bumper stickers and merchandise and memorabilia. American exceptionalism. That's what the entertainment system does to an artist. That's what we see them do with all of these superhero films, all these Marvel blockbusters, all of the safe studio projects that don't take risks. These artists who are in the system, they either break free from the shackles or are swallowed whole by it. And maybe this is controversial, but I think it was amazingly effective how Baz worked in some of the 90s pop songs in there. Songs from a bubblegum era of manufactured stars like Britney Spears, NSYNC, the Backstreet Boys, who spent so much of their lives and careers being used the way Elvis was used by Tom Parker, especially Britney Spears. It's an incredibly deliberate thing and very tastefully woven in, almost subtle. You don't realize what you're hearing until you're like, oh yeah, that sounds like Toxic by Britney Spears. And it harkens back to that earlier question. Has anything changed in how we treat these artists, these creatives, since Elvis? Will it ever change? There might have been hope for Elvis, which is the biggest tragedy of it all. Priscilla is the one to help get Elvis out of the commercial stagnation he's in. She encourages him to pursue the kind of music he loves, the music in his heart, to pursue his dream of being a great actor like Jimmy Dean. She was there for him. She supported him, but the Colonel's grip was too tight. His meeting with his new management at the Hollywood sign is similarly tragic. How Elvis remarks that
The sign was beautiful then, and now feels as though lots of things are like that these days. Broke down, beat up, rotten.
he fights and tries to claw his way out of the soul-sucking abyss the Colonel has sent him to, and he breaks free every now and then. He belts his heart out so people can hear him and hear what he believes in, even when he isn't explicitly saying it. But ultimately, the Colonel will slowly cut away all the people that are trying to help Elvis until he's the only one who remains. And that's where the 68 Christmas special, the comeback special, arguably the standout sequence of a film that is filled with brilliance, comes in. The 68 special is Elvis reclaiming his image. It's self-made, not manufactured, and arguably the only instance he was truly able to do so in his career, aside from when he first started. Even the song selections really speak to what he was trying to do. They weren't the Hollywood songs, they were the black songs he popularized and brought into the limelight. He was letting the world know where he stood and who he stood with, and he was making a stand. He was showing the power, the spirit, the soul of black music. He was making the point that the rock and roll music we love, that was sweeping the nation at the time, that was evoking an emotional response out of people, stems from gospel, rhythm, and blues. And he's shedding light on the artists who made that music possible in the first place. And he's unafraid of saying that that's the music he loves, the music he believes in, the music that makes him happy. He's trying to break down barriers and unify people of all races, cultures, backgrounds, even if the Colonel thinks he's throwing away his career to sing spirituals with a bunch of long hairs. The Colonel doesn't get it, and he never would have gotten it. He only sees dollar signs, not actual soul. Elvis is personifying the cultural melting pot that is America by bringing together everyone of different backgrounds, all the things that made him who he was, that he loves, and he's celebrating it. This is where Elvis truly starts to break free. The love is flowing, the free-spiritedness and equality. This special is a snapshot of the harmonious life we could all have, that we should strive for, and then bang! RFK is shot. And suddenly, Elvis feels overcome with the need to do what Robert Kennedy did in the wake of Martin Luther King's assassination. Of course, Tom Parker would have none of it. This is something we still face now, having to find the bravery to speak up even if the powers that be make it difficult to. So many people don't want to say anything about touchy subjects like that because there's a rallying cry of get politics out of entertainment. But that's where art is at its strongest. Politics and art have always been married together, and to divorce the two is a disservice to each side. When you only look out for yourself and your bottom line, and you let the rest of the world destroy itself, you are complicit in the bad stuff that happens. Not saying something is just as bad as siding with the racists. It's not enough to be neutral. You need to help your fellow human speak out. The bigots and the racists, they operate out of fear. Fear controls their lives, and they use that to control the lives of others, especially during the civil rights movement where fear controlled the actions of so many. So many were afraid to go against the status quo, to speak out and say, hey, you know that racism thing? It's pretty bad. Segregation is bad and we need to change this. Elvis was held back by the Colonel for most of his life, but those moments where he took the reins, took control of his own life, are the most profound moments in his career, and I would argue is what cemented his legacy as an icon. He wasn't just a vapid entertainer, he was someone with deep connections to gospel, soul, the black community, and when he was allowed to soar, he was the great uniter. By fighting against fear, you inspire more people to do the same. Yes, it is a risk, it is scary, but there are people who have your back, who believe in you, and who you will inspire. RFK and MLK did that for Elvis, reminded him of what he once stood for. In 1968, it was time for Elvis to pay it forward, to carry the message, regardless of the cost or whatever fear-mongering is going on, and he succeeded. But the Colonel would find a way to punish him for it afterwards. After manipulating Elvis into a predatory Vegas residence, anytime Elvis wanted to get back into the world, he used fear to hold Elvis back. Elvis wanted to tour outside of the United States, and Parker brought in death threats.
They're 100 times more dangerous. Am I the only one who thinks about security?
A country like Peru wanted to see Elvis perform. He had legions of fans there, and yet he was never allowed to go there and visit, give them time they deserved with him. Elvis really wanted to travel and become international, become a global icon, not an American icon, and the Colonel clipped his wings. The thing is, Elvis isn't an American exclusive. Even though the Colonel tried to make that a thing, he belonged to the world. He was an artist for everyone who just happened to be from America. He perpetuates a ridiculous delusion that America is safer than the rest of the world. America is your best friend, your home. Bad stuff doesn't happen here. Look, it's all lollipops and rainbows. Ignore the racism, mass shootings, poverty. We have Vegas. Spectacle, safety. It's all under our control, so that makes it safer. Plus, in Vegas, Tom Parker has the home field advantage. Vegas is the modern embodiment of the carnival, and the Colonel knows that. Knows Elvis can become the main attraction to the show and cure all their financial burdens, meaning his financial burdens. Obviously, this comes at the cost of the art form, the soul. He reels Elvis in with the idea of a risk-free chance to put on the show he wants to put on, no cost. But everything comes at a cost. Nothing is free. There's always a catch, just like in the American economy. If something sounds too good to be true, it usually is. The cost just might not be what you expect. They need the consumer more than the consumer needs them. Vegas needs Elvis more than Elvis needs Vegas, and yet Elvis gets caught in a trap. It's honestly a miracle that Elvis was able to make the impact he did in Vegas, put on the show with the same amount of passion and heart he did night after night. It really speaks to how sacred the stage was for him and how special and important that relationship with the audience was. And the Colonel gets all his debts canceled and an unlimited line of credit. That's the power of the American system. It'll keep reeling you in, offering you credit until it's time to pay up, and then you can't, and it ruins you. I also love the little aside Parker makes to the audience. Priscilla could never compete with the love Elvis felt for you. Elvis was addicted to performing, to the love he felt from an audience, a love rooted in his earliest days on stage. And it was that addiction, along with the manipulation of the Colonel, that ultimately led to his demise. The Colonel fed Elvis's addiction just as much as Elvis desired it to be fed. He became a spectacle, pumped full of drugs and drained for profit night after night. With no time for rest or for travel, Elvis was turned into a slot machine. The Colonel created a way to sell American exceptionalism to the world with the satellite show broadcast to the world for one night exclusively from the US. He forced Elvis to become a United States exclusive, and if you wanted to see him, if you wanted to consume him, you would need to come to America. And by forcing Elvis to be only available to America, Parker ironically strengthened the case that the American dream is an unattainable illusion. Baz does a tremendous job of exploring the tug and pull, the conflict over the very soul of Elvis, and the tragedy is he never truly gets to fly. I mean, he does for a moment. He flies extremely high, almost too close to the sun, but like I said, the Colonel clipped his wings. Elvis never reached that pinnacle he wanted for himself. He became a tragic American stage attraction when he was so much more than that. Even if all you think he was on top of the American stage attraction was just someone who wanted to travel around the world and unite everyone, that was still a goal he didn't get to achieve because his desire to immortalize himself was being exploited by a carny who was only interested in the very same thing.
We are two odd, lonely children reaching for eternity.
Parker mused.
See, my boy, the truth about the rock of eternity, it is forever just beyond our reach.
That's the scam of American commercialism. It's insatiable. The dream you're fed is unattainable because it doesn't exist. You're stuck in a trap. You can't walk out. Your life is a cycle. There's no challenge. There's no advancing your creative pursuits, no trying anything new. We all just go through the same motions, do the same tours, are left with nothing, and in Elvis's case, is cursed by the fame and fortune the Colonel helped him amass.
Nobody's gonna remember me. I've never done anything lasting. I never made that classic film that I could be proud of.
The spectacle killed his dreams. It ultimately killed Elvis Presley, and the film does not shy away from stating that as a fact. And yet, in one final magical salvo, the ending of Elvis manages to be so goddamn profound. It's maybe the one section of the film that is most beholden to the cliched Hollywood biopic formula. The last big performance before the untimely passing, and even the reel of footage of the real Elvis that opens the end credits is a familiar beat, but it's incredibly effective. Unchained Melody is so deeply tragic. This melancholic cry out to a missed love, and yet it's simultaneously beautiful because it doesn't obsess or beg. He never lost his faith in people. He never stopped loving them, never stopped trying, because if you dream it, you do it. And even though Elvis was all out of dreams, he never fully believed that and never gave up. That's really the great tragedy of it all. The American dream took his real dreams and left him with nothing, swallowed him whole, mined him of all his talent, and ripped out his soul. And that's what makes Elvis a cautionary tale of the American dream. And yet, to the last, he tried to deliver, to make a return to sender of the magic he picked up from the black music he grew up around. Did he succeed? I don't know. I do think he tried his best, and I believe Baz thinks so too. Elvis Presley's life is such a surreal life, an extraordinary life that almost feels impossible to believe really happened in America. I mean, remember what I was saying earlier. Elvis didn't feel like a real person, and Baz knows this, and that's what makes his cross-cutting during Unchained Melody between Austin and the real Elvis both heartbreaking and a perfect finale. As Baz Luhrmann says, Elvis's life is so unreal. What happens if you suddenly saw Elvis and then looked at Austin, looked back at Elvis and went, oh my God, it's all true. He was the real deal, and yet Elvis can also be whatever you want Elvis to be. He put it all out there for us. And Baz stopped at nothing to make sure we all know it. It's not just him performing. We also cut to earlier moments in his life in The Ascension. I do exactly the same thing in Romeo and Juliet. And instead of leaving you with the tragedy of these two young people who've taken their lives, as we rise up and we hear the Wagner, we see their romance. We see the beautiful part of their life, the life they've lived together. That's what they leave behind. I know not everyone will agree, not everyone's gonna vibe with Tom Hanks's Kentucky Fried Colonel Tom Parker, but to me, Elvis is a masterpiece. It's Baz Luhrmann's masterpiece. It's a film that explores the idea of spectacle at the cost of soul. It's why it's less a straightforward biopic and more a chronicling of the story of America during the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, about what the explosion of American pop culture during that era did, exploiting a person's talent, constructing an image that can be commercialized and sold, and reducing the complicated beauty of who they are to the dollar signs you can instead just wring from the idealized notion of them. It's the evolution of the carnival on a grand scale, and it's also what makes Tom Parker a great narrator, the same reason he was a great con man, because he recognized what people wanted, where the culture was at, and then basically constructed an image of a superhero out of a young, talented, soulful man just singing the blues. The film is a constant tug and pull between the soul of an artist and the manufactured version of them, until the spectacle wins out. It's honestly really fascinating how between Elvis, Nope, and Babylon, 2022 had a lot to say about spectacle and the uglier side of it. But here, Austin Butler explodes as a bona fide star in the performance of a lifetime. And as much as I love a lot of Baz Luhrmann's other films, I'm not sure if it's ever felt like Baz has been more in control of one of his films or that he's ever made a more accessible film. Not that that necessarily matters, but still. The concert sequences are visceral as all hell. It's maximalist filmmaking to the highest order, and it works because this isn't just the story of Elvis Presley. It's the chronicling of America. It's an epic American tragedy. The scope of this film is massive, and so the filmmaking is massive alongside it. Has to be. That in turn makes it even more effective at delivering its message. So what made Elvis absolutely explode? Well, what makes the musical biopic so popular? Even relative to biopics overall, there seems to exist a disproportionate interest in telling the stories of the most famous musicians we've ever known. It seems like ever since Coal Miner's Daughter, La Bamba, and funnily enough, another Elvis biopic right before those two, which starred Kurt Russell, the floodgates were let loose and never really stopped during the 90s and 2000s. But things ramped up a gear during the 10s, with the likes of Get On Up, Straight Outta Compton, Love and Mercy, Rocket Man, and you know, Bohemian Rhapsody, which is as screenplay by Wikipedia as one of these things gets, feels particularly explosive. Obviously, studios are going to want to capture the same recipe and create $900 million in ticket sales, but it's like there's a desperation to hit every single major beat of a musician's life in most of these. It's hilarious that they still pump out the womb to tomb variety because Walk Hard, the Dewey Cox story, so perfectly matched their structure in parodying them, that any of the earnest attempts at the formula, like Bohemian Rhapsody, feel in themselves like a parody. But I think these things resonate with audiences, one, because you'll inevitably draw in the fan base of whatever artist or band you're chronicling, but also it's because, unless you're making a film about some relatively obscure act in pop culture, you'll have at least one generation who are sentimental about the music because it was the soundtrack to their lives. Maybe it's even the way our country is so widely enamored with the American dream. These biopics promise, in their trailers, a case study of it coming true, almost to invariably pull the rug out and show its elusiveness. You could even say it's like Lucy in the football. This story is going to uplift you and make you believe. I don't know, Hollywood, it didn't work out so well for Whitney. Just trust me, come on. I put it this way, we have a tendency to mythologize these figures, to construct an image because it's all part of the sell. We want to consume them, so much so that half the time they aren't even viewed as people. Only recently does it feel like the humanity in artists is being properly celebrated. Like it's what we want out of people in the spotlight. We don't want to consume them, we want to relate to them. We want to humanize them because then we understand them. In turn, their message gets through properly. Something unimaginable during the time of Elvis, where the facade, the image was desired rather than the person in their soul. When the opposite happens, that's when an artist is actually able to tell their truth, bring forth the human element that makes the work resonate. People think they may have loved Elvis because of the spectacle, because of the snow job, but in actuality, they loved Elvis because of the humanity and soul. And you can tell the difference between when he's been zapped of it and when he gets to fully unleash it. In a way, this is why the Beatles were the shot in the arm he needed in an era where he'd become a bit too tame, too sanitized, just another old Hollywood face. The Beatles pushed Elvis to return to his roots, return to the truth he found in his music up on stage while he performed. I mean, we don't get Suspicious Minds if not for the Beatles, and that's something of an artistic peak for Elvis. I doubt we would have gotten the '68 special either, and that's where Baz Luhrmann makes one last push to have Elvis defy the cliches and expectations that accompany the biopic formula. I think maybe it's even Baz's greatest trick of the hundreds he performs in this film. He doesn't deny through Elvis that the American dream is unattainable, that it didn't really happen for Elvis, and that his pursuit of it was arguably his ruin. But he still manages to end on an uplifting note anyway. Elvis Presley lived an impossible life in the flash of 42 years. He managed to be the poster boy of rebellion and nurtured his musicianship in the crossroads of a musical influence that was rooted in black music. He became a sensation at just the right moment to maximize his fame, and then he thrived as a Hollywood movie star, swimming in money before the rebirth of his musical icon in the 70s. It's a massive, epic life, despite the tragedy of his death. And ultimately, Elvis did achieve one of the all-time great legacies in pop culture history, and he persists nearly 50 years after his passing as a beloved idol to millions of people. Maybe that's a hollow trade-off for our having lost the real deal. Maybe it's even a bad thing that Elvis Presley, the complete brilliant man and artist who once was, now exists only in our memories, and you could even say he's been reduced to a Halloween costume. But whether or not the long-term legacy of Elvis has played out in an ideal way, one thing is for certain. If Elvis's biggest fear at the end was that no one will ever remember me, he could not have had less to worry about, because we will never forget Elvis Presley. And we will never forget Baz Luhrmann's Elvis.